Welcome to FBC Benbrook Monthly, a monthly video podcast where we discuss issues of faith, culture, and family. My name's Tim Tucker. I'm a worship leader here at FBC Benbrook, and this month I sit down with our pastor, Todd Pylant, to ask the question, are Christians intolerant? If you haven't already, subscribe to our channel, and thanks so much for watching.
Well, Tim, you may or may not have heard the news. There's an Australian rugby star who recently got fired from his team, and it really wasn't because of substance abuse or any crime that he did. It's because of things that he posted on social media. And so this guy, Israel Folau, I think is how you pronounce his name, he's a Christian, very strong Christian, and he posts Bible verses on his Instagram account, and he's kind of an aggressive apologist kind of guy, and so he quotes verses about, from Revelation and Galatians, the deeds of the flesh and people who aren't going to be in heaven. And one of his recent posts are sins from which we need to repent. And then he listed drunkenness, homosexuality, adultery, lying, sexual immorality, stealing, atheism, and idolatry, which is kind of a loose quote of a verse from Revelation. Well, that's got him fired. And the CEO of his team said, quote, "We want to make it clear he does not speak for the game with his recent social media post, and he's failed to understand the expectation of him as a rugby star, and he cannot share material on social media that condemns, vilifies, or discriminates against people on the basis of their sexuality." So this biggest rugby star in Australia got fired basically because of intolerant posts on his Instagram account.
Right, so I think the initial question we feel like we need to ask here is Israel Folau being intolerant? I don't know if I would use the same tactic that he's using.
A little harsh.
It seems harsh and abrasive, but the reality is that what he's saying, the scriptures he's posting, what he's saying is truthful. And I think his heart's intent is to see people repent and turn to Jesus. So as we're trying to figure out what to do with this and for us to move forward, what's the real issue going on?
Well, and it's that word intolerance. So D.A. Carson, about 7 years ago, wrote a book, and he had a great title. He called it The Intolerance of Tolerance. And in his book, it was interesting. I think he would change it if he wrote it today, 7 years ago. And he was talking about how the definition of tolerance has changed. So it used to be when we use the word tolerant to say, I've had an opinion, you have a different opinion, we disagree, but I tolerate your disagreements. Let's sit down and let's talk about this. And kind of we can agree to disagree. That's kind of the old definition of tolerance. Well, 7 years ago, D.A. Carson was saying there's a new definition of tolerance. And the new definition is no moral opinion is right. We're all kind of on equal ground. And the greatest crime that you can do is for one person to say, I'm right and you're wrong. So that is being intolerant. But of course, what he's saying is, while we are valuing tolerance, the reality is once you get labeled intolerant, people can treat you however they want because you are guilty of this horrible crime. I think if he were to write that book today, in 2019, he would say there's been a third shift in this whole tolerance idea. And so it's not, we agree to disagree, it's not that all views are the same, but in this new age, there is a new definition, and a lot of times it is around sexual ethics and the moral revolution. And if you're not on board with this, if you speak anything against that, you are labeled intolerant. And once you get labeled intolerant, you can be treated horribly because you're intolerant. And that forgives every kind of mistreatment. And so in this conversation, the reality of definition of terms is very important. We see this in the abortion debate. If you label it women's rights or women's health care, reproductive rights, those are all words that, because everyone agrees upon those things, but it's not really the issue. The issue is not, does a woman have a right over her own body? The issue is there another body involved in this process? That's the question. So how we define the terms of tolerance are very important in understanding what's going on.
And I think it's important for us to notice and important for us to realize is that this is not a new issue for the church. Paul was repeatedly beaten and thrown out of town. Well, in our culture, nobody really does that anymore. But what they do, the modern version of being thrown out of town is to be labeled intolerant. But I think it's important for us to realize that for 2,000 years, the gospel has been considered foolishness by most of cultures and most of the world. So, and it's no secret that we're in the midst of a moral revolution, particularly in North America. And so I think for church people, we feel like we only have two options. We either lower our moral standards and sort of abandon biblical moral standards so that we're on the right side of history.
Yeah, that's such a key phrase.
Right.
We want to be on the right side of history.
Or we stick to our old-fashioned biblical morals and separate ourselves from the culture and sort of pull away from the culture and condemn and shy away from that. But neither one of those are really good options. So what is it that we do?
Yeah, or suffer this horrible indignity of being ostracized, labeled as an intolerant, flat earther, that kind of thing. Well, I think your point is very important, the fact that the gospel was birthed in a pagan land with sexual ethics that were way outside of biblical ethics and all sorts of beliefs about other gods and other deities. And so when Paul preaches Christ is the only way, that was very intolerant. And when he preached the biblical sexual ethics, that was very intolerant as well. And so your point about how the church has always been here is important. There's a passage in 1 Peter. Peter wrote his letter and he called them to the exiles, to the elect exiles who were scattered about. And he uses this analogy that Christians are living as exiles in a world that is not their own. And the world in which they live in laughs at them. In fact, he says in 1 Peter 4, they malign you because you do not run with them in the same excess of immorality. And so you're getting mocked, and that's exactly what's happening here. And in the midst of all that, so this is Peter's advice to those who live in a culture that would consider them, to use our words, to be intolerant outside. He says in 1 Peter 2:11, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul, and keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. And so Peter's recognizing here that we are, in fact, exiles. But he gives us some advice: abstain from the passions of the flesh. So don't fall into the world's understanding of morality, particular sexual ethics. There is a war going on against our soul, but we are to keep our conduct honorable. And even as they speak against us, he uses evildoer, we would say intolerant, they will still see our good deeds. And when Christ returns, basically they will be able to see the truth. I would just recommend, I finished reading a book recently called Evangelism as Exiles. And this is, Elliot Clark was a former missionary to a Muslim majority country. And really it's a study of 1 Peter. And he talks about how, just like he was in a Muslim majority country representing Christ, how he was in exile. Basically saying that's what has happened in America. We're no longer in a Christian majority country. We're seen as intolerant. We're exiles. And so he says we need to begin to do evangelism and live as exiles. So it's an interesting book. I recommend that to you as well.
Yeah. So we just want to encourage you, not to be afraid of the word intolerant or afraid to be labeled intolerant. It's nothing new for the church, and it's not an indication that the Christian faith is going away or that we're somehow losing something. So I just want to encourage you with that this month. And thank you for watching, and we'll see you next month.